20 or 30 little nude statues of me out there in the world.
Right. I fell in love with more than one figure model over the years, I'll tell you. And you have to handle yourself. I mean, that was when I was a student,
Yeah.
but as an adult, you book models often for 3 weeks running. And
Hmm.
for some reason, every once in a while, women in my class would say, "Can we get a guy?" It's like, why would you want a guy? You have to, to be blunt, if you are attracted to a woman that you've hired to work with, it's completely inappropriate to express it until,
Yeah.
you
But
know,
it is fun,
the
I
last
don't know.
week. And, and she is no longer your employee, so to say. You
Oh,
fix
we
the
had all
coffee.
sorts of rules, like, they weren't allowed to approach us, on campus and, bring up like, hey, you were the naked model. There was all these rules put in place, but inevitably it was like years later, you're like, how do I know you? And it's like, I know how we know each other.
Nice
That kind of
to
thing. But
see
it
you
was
again,
all,
or some of you.
I had so many friends that were artists. It was just kind of like, hey, you'd be good. Do this for us. You'll be comfortable because it's all your friends. Just do it. And man, it was still nerve wracking, but I did it. It was good fun. But I'm going to hit play again on the recording, and then Chase is going to jump in with a question for you.
Great.
So,
Okay.
all right, 3, 2, 1. And yeah, we're back. And Chase is going to lead us off, Peter, with a few questions for you. If you could elaborate on his questions, that would be great. We can take this in another direction. So jump on in,
Perfect.
Chase.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, Peter, I have two questions here. I've listened to you, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about this. Grant asked you a question earlier about how your experiences with the phenomenon had potentially shifted your path in life with respect to your art. And this is in the same vein of that thought. I'm curious. I'm with you. Anybody that speaks in absolutes with respect to the phenomenon needs to go away, because there may be a few of us, a few people out there that know themselves, something to be one way or the other. But so much of this is so confusing. But having said that, there are people in the community that believe that, or have a strong opinion that, it's likely that we have these predefined paths that we pick, and that the alien abduction phenomenon is related to the non-physical phenomenon and this idea of non-locality and etc. So my question would be, if you have an opinion on the path idea, or the idea of a path, and whether or not you tend to lean one way or the other, how do you believe your experiences with the phenomenon, or without having these experiences with the phenomenon, have shaped you on your path? I mean, do you feel, I hope that's clear. Does that make sense?
Elucidate just a little bit more.
Okay. Your experiences with the phenomenon having shaped what you've done in your life, and your feeling of accomplishment in life, or having learned certain lessons in life. Do you feel, if you hadn't had these experiences, if you and your sister hadn't had that initial experience, that kind of kick-started you down this alternate path, do you feel? Yeah, I'm having such a hard time articulating this, Peter.
I can maybe jump in a little bit
Yeah,
here
can you help
on
me?
this.
Okay.
I know we've talked about this before, where a life-changing moment kind of sets you on course. And Peter, you've said that it kind of took you off the course you were already on. And then there are a few of us in the field that kind of maybe stray away from saying it set us on a life course, but maybe it's made us realize that at certain points we're right where we need to be effective in this community. So do you have any, I think a term we use with this is synchronicities. Are there any synchronicities throughout your stories that have maybe guided you to this or away from it? And could you elaborate on that?
Right. No, thanks for that, Nicole.
It's tough sometimes, I know.
Well, for starters, one of the things as a boy growing up in a much more innocent time that I knew I wanted in life was to have an interesting life. And as the world opened up to me more, mostly through the world of books and movies, and an innocent hobby as a kid, stamp collecting, and knowing, I mean, now it just all seems so passé on a certain level because there's so much input from so many corners of the digital and the real world that, you know, you need are right there in front of you. But for me as a boy, the idea that this little piece of paper had been in India or China or Australia or France, all these places that I knew on the globe. And, you know, I always liked maps and, you know, stories of foreign places that possibly I might get to see some of the world. And the idea of one of the things about being a successful artist was that it could get me to different parts of the world and travel. I've been very lucky in some ways in that I have traveled a lot, more on my own than in conferences that I've been invited to speak, although the subject of UFOs has taken me to Rome and Athens and Tokyo and Paris and so many wonderful places that I might not have, and back and forth to England 25 times, might not have visited otherwise. But when I was younger, again, you can't do this now. After I failed my draft physical for the Army to go into Vietnam, I knew I needed some kind of coming of age experience, and I got a job as a deckhand on a Norwegian freighter and worked my way across the ocean, and then just started to drift east at a time when you could travel on very little money, and ended up not being gone for a month or two like I had thought, but for a year, and making my way almost to the Tibetan border, overland and back. I got to know myself very well and come to feel I was a citizen of the world. It doesn't answer your question.
No, and maybe I could just try and get a little more precise here. How about, do you feel as if your experiences with respect to the phenomenon were meant to happen or just coincidence? How's that?
Stanton Friedman had a wonderful phrase on things that he was not sure of or had yet to decide on or needed more information to come to an informed conclusion. He said, that's in my gray box. The idea of predestination versus free will has fascinated me since I was in my 20s. And I think both of those things exist. I don't come down with on one side or another completely. I think there are certain parts of our paths that were meant to be, and other parts that are as random as where lightning will strike the ground next, and that they interweave themselves in life. I know many people who have built entire life philosophies on one of these presuppositions. I am not one of them, but there have been times in my life when I have come to realize in a minor epiphany that, here's a fork in the road. I have two ways that I can go here, which will determine something about what happens to my life next. I'll choose A. Now, somebody else might say, and it's more caught up in new age thinking of, you only thought that was free will. You were programmed to do that. That was self-determined in your DNA. The aliens wanted you to do it, and that everything is mapped out. You know, it's all in the book already. Maybe yes, maybe no. If so, I still live with the illusion that I made my own decision there.
In this regard, Peter, can I ask you about, can you talk about the one that seems to stick out, and that's the Rendlesham Forest,
Yeah.
which I think you called your most dramatic sighting of all times, where you go there on this big path that you took to do Rendlesham Forest, and suddenly they were there. So can you tell the story about the Rendlesham Forest experience?
Sure. I'd say certainly one of my two big ones, nothing displaces my childhood event with my sister. And again, that was a clear daylight, not a cloud in the sky, completely unambiguous. 5 disc-shaped objects in a formation close enough to make out regular detailing around the edge of each. But on my very first research trip to the United Kingdom, to begin to get out of the armchair phase of my initial Rendlesham education, which had lasted almost half a year, on my first night in Suffolk, not 6 miles away from the site of the alleged third night event, my then co-author and I, within sight of the base, had a multiple UFO sighting that started at 9 o'clock at night. I know because I checked my watch, and was still going on at 11:30 when 11:30 or 10:30, maybe it was 10:30, probably 10:30 because it was about an hour and a half. It was still going on. We had flown in the day before. We were still jet lagged. And that's one that at first, well, what it was nothing less than star size things in the sky that looked like stars until they zigzagged. A thing that came out of the woods, lit up like it was on a ramp and taking off into the cosmos. Disc-shaped objects hovering above the woods, everything culminating in something landing at the far or appearing at the far end of the field that seemed to have regularly placed lights on it. We all know those times in our lives when you are having an experience that puts you into a state of shock. And I don't mean it in the abstract. I mean, I was working crisis intervention at the time, and one of my escape involvements at the moment was documenting in my own little mind what was happening physiologically with me. Auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, my respiration rate was changing. I was completely transfixed by these things. And at the time, because that's the way I worked, I had a micro cassette recorder in each pocket with new batteries and a tape in each one. And when it started at 9:30, I handed the other one to Larry Warren and said, pointing to this disc shape over the Rendlesham Forest, does that look like a tipped ellipse to you? I wasn't aware until I got back to America and started the very slow process of transcribing the tapes. Slow in that I had no awareness that the wind was ripping across the top of the mic the whole time. There was a lot of distortion. And knowing that I might get called on these transcripts at some point, I'd listen to some things 40 or 50 times. And ultimately, I thought I was saying a pair of lips instead of tipped ellipse. Not that that couldn't be misunderstood as sort of tipped ellipse like. But Grant, all I can tell you was while it was happening and thinking, wait a minute, among other things, This is the first night of my first visit here. I'm going to be here a week. I figured this would be my only trip there. I had no idea, once again, this obsession would set in and I'd return and return and return over the years to come. That book, from shaking hands with my erstwhile former co-author to seeing the book out, was a full decade, and not the most pleasant 10 years of my life. I can say that. That was pure obsession. But that haunting, weird feeling of what's going on here, on top of what's going on here, in terms of the odds that this is going on, you know, so close to where it went on, what is going on here? And although Larry suggested it a day or two later, that maybe, you know, this was set up for me, I still don't know, but I'm much more open to the possibility now, which I would have rejected completely at the time. It was just too mystical and too weird and too creepy. I am aware now, though, for what it's worth. And that when I would enter the United Kingdom, forces that already knew what I was doing. I had, when I came back from that trip, started to notice noises that shouldn't be on my phone. And in one way, we all know that feeling, or maybe you don't, but if you do this work and you really get deep into it, it's kind of what I would call a romantic paranoia. You know, they know who I am. They're after me. They're watching me. I'm, you know, messing around. The government's concerned about me. I got to watch my ass and all that stuff. It's more often than not self-aggrandizing and sort of having this cool sort of spy fantasy. But I did have my phone checked out. And it was a guy who worked for AT&T, the big conglomerate at the time before they broke it up, who moonlighted doing installations and things. And I had a friend who was a PI, private investigator, who hooked me up with him. And he said, no, your phone is being monitored irregularly. And I freaked. You know, part of me wanted it to happen because it would validate how cool I was, you know, in doing this crazy work. But I immediately said, no, that's ridiculous. First, we're in the middle of New York City. It's amazing that anything works at all. It's probably just something touching another thing, you know, and nothing. Anyway, the whole purpose of monitoring somebody's phone is to surreptitiously pick up on what they're saying. The last thing you want to do is give it away. He said, yes and no. There are two reasons. One is just what you've stated. The other is that so some party has a desire that you know that at least some of your calls are being monitored to emotionally destabilize you, which freaked me out. But over the years afterwards, I have been open to that very real possibility that they were setting me up for this, because I'll tell you one thing, I had my doubts about my co-author, and I write about them in my book. Certain inconsistencies, certain things that just registered in the first months. But that night, February 18th, 1988, 5 months into working with him, I thought, you know what? You've either got to accept what he's saying and work with him and assume he's PTSD'd out, or reject it. And the best thing that ever happened to him, in a way, because years later, that whole case blew up in a tremendous scandal around me, because he had manipulated data. He was a brilliant fabricator and liar, very charismatic, and he fooled a lot of people, not just myself, but I have to live with the fact that I helped him become well known in the work and respected as a result. But that from that point on, I had to take it seriously, because I was now involved. I had seen it. I had experienced it on location, and the world be damned, it was him and me together, and we're going to prove that he was involved in this. Of course, it's still a very important case. And there have been quite a number of really valuable books written on it. To just close the question, 3 years ago or so, I realized I had truly become, unlike any time since, and I expect again, completely and totally burnt out on this one case and very publicly remove myself from involvement in it. There's still a lot going on in the world of UFOs and other intelligences aside from Rendlesham, but I don't want anybody to think that I reject the reality of the series of incidents not involving my former co-author.
You mentioned they and then they. So Bud, I think, was asked this question. Did you ever have the discussion with Bud? Because it would make sense that if there's this phenomena going on, the government's going to look at the guy who's the top guy, like Bud.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to be monitoring. So did you and Bud have these conversations? Because I think Bud was given this question numerous times. Did the government ever contact you? Do you think the government's watching your research? So did you have those conversations with Bud?
Absolutely. And John Mack and Dave Jacobs and quite a number of Stanton Friedman. And again, when you begin this process and you hit a point, if you do, where you're now involved in a serious project and making inroads and realizing that if you ever complete it and publish it, forget about all the esoteric and weirdball and, otherworldly stuff. There are people, agencies, groups, organizations here on Earth that you potentially may embarrass or even inadvertently expose or put attention on that they do not want. And yes, without question, we all understood that that was a reality, not to the point that, like Gray Barker's wonderful esoteric writing or, the whole Men in Black paranoid stuff that, you're being followed. Although there came a point in my life in the 90s, after years of working this case and coming into putting more and more pieces together. And as you know, if you've been involved in an extensive research project, especially with an eye on publishing, you work on it for months and months and months and sometimes years, and you have a narrative thread going on, fully documented, and then another amazing piece comes to you that fills in an important blank, gives it more gravitas, gives it more credibility, and makes it more potentially embarrassing or dangerous to somebody who doesn't want it to see the light of day. And I did become really quite seriously paranoid for a period of months toward the end of it. And it didn't stop until I handed in the series of floppy disks to my American publisher in 1996, the books being published the year after. But yeah, I think you've got to be naive, especially if you get to a certain level in the field, to think that the very terrestrial forces that be in Washington, Maryland, Virginia, you name where the office might be, are not keeping informal tabs. I think that's changing now, or at least shifting, because everything's changing around this, as you guys know. And after the New York Times kind of led the way and other major media started to fall into place, interestingly, whether it's CNBC or Fox, everybody's taking this stuff seriously now. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had invested so many years in studying the origins of the ridicule factor, which became a popular lecture topic for me and a topic that I wrote and published on a number of times, that it was like, wait a minute, I'm not hearing the echo anymore. Here's a report on major news and the newsreader isn't raising his eyebrow or making a joke with the newsman or wink, wink, nudge, nudge. How is there some edict, or is this just part of the process? And everybody is falling into line, because it's a lot easier and a lot more honest to take it seriously than go through all of the silly reactions that major media has posed over the decades since 1947.
Okay.
I can round this out a bit, I guess, with a small question, which will kind of ties into what we brought up with the scenario of the War of the Worlds. It kind of reflected where society was at that point in our time. And Peter, this ties into what I was told you I wanted to ask before we went on air. you've done a whole conference, or you gave a whole lecture on ufology being in advertising and media. And we've kind of seen this vein over the years, and it's even brought up comedically, like, oh, there's always the laugh factor and the scorn factor. But we do toss around the idea that comedy does have this influence of changing social structure and how society believes in things. And I think we're witnessing that to the point where I know I've had so many discussions, and it cracks me up. I can't turn on a cartoon for my son without it being alien based,
Right.
or saucers in it, or at least an episode that involves it. But now there's just so much infiltration into pop culture.
Right.
Do you see this as sort of a slow roll of influence to maybe gauge where our society is now, so we can get past the ridicule side? So
That's a
take
great
it away,
question.
Peter.
Yeah, a great question, Nicole. The talk that you're referring to was one that started because I have a very still, and always will, a very deep interest in the visual arts, in illustration, in the power of persuasion. Studied deeply things like the Tavistock Institute in London, a very heavy organization who are pioneers in manipulation of consciousness, belief, and Lord knows we're all subjected to it every single day, and never more than right now in our political and popular history. But I, like a lot of people in the work, I just started to clip ads that had, a UFO or an alien type illustration. At a certain point, realized I had a fairly formidable file, then contacted a number of friends, colleagues in the States, but also in the UK, in Europe, and South America, and acquired more. And my query was, is this simply a matter that ads that have, goofy aliens and flying saucers help sell products, whether it's a mom and pop ice cream operation or a multinational technology oriented corporation, or is there some overlord kind of control of this, or that it's being engineered to happen? When I first got involved in the subject, again in the mid 70s, we did not see this plethora in popular culture. Of course, there have been UFO, flying saucer movies, alien movies. It goes back to the earliest silent films, A Trip to the Moon from 1904, one of the just most brilliantly innocent. And, you take it back into the world of science fiction and Jules Verne and people like that. But yeah, I think part of it is just for kids and adults. For kids generally, it's just fascinating and cool and interesting. And, you look up at the sky, and of course you're not alone. Of course there are other living beings and civilizations and things out there. It's not even a question. If you are an adult and grew up at a time when this was understood to be nonsensical or delusional or something that adults did not take seriously, if you're intelligent, if you're thoughtful, in the back of your mind that you are open to it, but it's not something you're going to express socially or get involved with in a public manner, because that will only attract ridicule. And especially if you're a career person, in certain careers it can hurt or even sink. Science and politics being two at the top of the pile. And I came away feeling that both things are not just possible, but to a degree going on. I think the lion's share is that advertising agencies, and for corporations that have their own in-house advertising groups, realize, this is what they do. They keep their ear to the ground. What will help sell our service or our product? And this is a given. It's one of the reasons why podcasts like this one, or big radio shows like Coast to Coast or Jimmy Church, that they have huge listenerships, and that there is a ready audience among people that's increasing now that the ridicule factor is dissipating. And also, as baby boomers age out, have discretionary time, open minds, they're the ones that would have been coming to more and more of the conferences this year. They're the ones who are making James Fox's The Phenomena go viral, because we forget we're all so involved in talking to each other in this community that we represent a very modest slice of the general population. And for me, one of my main increasing goals over the past years has been reaching that wider and wider demographic, because that's the future. And they're the ones who need the information. And all of us who are coming up through the ranks or in the ranks should be dedicating more and more of ourselves to that wonderful goal. We are going to need to reach a critical mass of the general population for it not to be as traumatic when humanity goes through that door in a way that's undeniable, what we call disclosure. But I think in the world of advertising and in popular culture, monkey see, monkey do. You have a UFO film out. Wow, that's cool. I'm going to have one. Oh, your one about contact was so good. Our smaller studio can do one with a less expensive actor, but a really good script. And look, I mean, we're making money on this stuff. Advertisers go to the movie. It's just feeding on itself. And again, if there was, let's say, an office within an agency, within a group, within the NSA charged with this, or another agency, saying, we have to make this happen. We have, you look back even at the Robertson panel report from 1953, they're talking about, we have friends in the media. And now it's a name lost to all but a few people, but Arthur Godfrey at the time was one of the biggest names in radio broadcasting. I remember my Nana listening to his show when I was a little boy, just a little variety show and interviews and songs and things. But he had impact in popular culture, enrolling the Walt Disney Cartoon Studios. People don't realize that it was just that until Disney, and it's important digression here, until Disney decided to invest everything they had and make their first live action film. And had that film failed at the box office, the Walt Disney Studios would have been 1927 to 1953, and it would closed. And it was a little film called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was the greatest film of my childhood and the first film I ever remember seeing in the theater, and made my imagination explode and became the first grown-up chapter book I ever read, my dad's copy from 1930. But contacting Disney, I think at this point, and for years already, if there is such an office, or there was such an office, they can go on permanent coffee break. It's all happening without them now, and nobody needs a push anymore.
Well, I don't think any of us can deny that there's a love affair between ufology and movie making, and it is creeping into pop culture these days. And I think maybe we can roll this into the music side of our conversation we want to have. But I think first, Chase has a follow-up question, or he'd like to jump in with one more question before we move it on. But let me know if we need to take another break. We can do that as well.
Well, what I'd like to do, because we're coming on 2 hours now, what I'd like to do is plan on doing another segment on this and music, so we can really get into it. I've earmarked a number of pop songs that we can analyze, look at lyrics, some very interesting backstories, and that we can give that area of the arts the focus it should have. But up for a follow-up question, and then let's plan to re-meet.
Sounds great.
Brilliant.
I know we could dedicate so much to just music alone. And like I said, this does cover more than just art or painting. So we will do a follow-up with you on music, Peter. So Take it away, Chase.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Brilliant. And on music, real briefly, you know, I've had, especially over the past 3 years, I've had quite a few experiences, and music has played a factor in that. I believe I've had direct communication with something via music. So would love to talk about that when the timing's right. But I wanted to get this question in because I haven't seen it anywhere else. And I hope this adds some value to the community. And that's, you know, I've studied Hopkins' work and Jacob's work and Mac's work, and Karen, I can't remember Karen's last name, but everyone that's really done any kind of extensive, you know, research into the alien abduction phenomenon. And there is this massive disconnect between the conclusions that Jacobs has drawn versus those that Hopkins and Mac drew. What do you have to say to that?
I've known David for decades. I think the world of him. David became involved in this subject, wanting nothing more than to publish his doctoral thesis on the impact of the UFO phenomena on American culture, which he did. And then it went on to become a book, The UFO Controversy in America. Unfortunately, out of print for many years now, as far as I'm aware. If you can find a copy, grab it. But when Dave first heard, and David also taught a course based on that book, and having nothing to do with the abduction phenomena per se, for 17 or 18 years at Temple University in Philadelphia, a course that was extremely popular, although not necessarily with the university, although it made the money and filled up that room year after year. When David heard about Bud's work, as he told me years ago, his first reaction, and John Mack told me the same thing, was, oh, there's a painter in New York that thinks that aliens are taking people into flying saucers and examining them. He's obviously has some mental issues to deal with. In Dave's case, it was a mutual friend, Tracy Torme, who is wrote the screenplay for Fire in the Sky, the film about the Travis Walton experience. Not completely accurate, but that was certainly nothing to do with Tracy. Has written a number of wonderful screenplays. And also, he knew Bud because his father, the very famous crooner Mel Torme, had had a phenomenal daylight sighting driving in the desert in California. And he grew up with a dad who was very public about it. Tracy ended up in the late 70s, and probably in the 80s as well, as a writer living in New York for Saturday Night Live. And he became, as somebody who was knowledgeable about UFOs, became friends with Bud's and would come over and hang out at the studio. But also a friend of Dave's told Dave about Bud and said, no, when Dave expressed his feelings about this painter, Tracy assured him that no, he had all his marbles and that he was doing important work. Dave came over and, like John, said it was one of the most important experiences of his life, and it got him involved in the same thing. Now, a lot of people who have no reason to feel otherwise think that, David is some dark figure in the work whose findings, whose allegations, whose published works point to very dark scenarios about these other intelligences. Dave, like Bud, and I say this putting my reputation on the line here because I believe what I'm saying here in no uncertain terms. I've spent too much time with both of them and know their character. Bud's case knew, and John too, that this was simply the data that was coming to them from the people that seeked them out. Remember that when Bud started to actively look into this subject and then became famous for it overnight on a certain level, he was publishing into the later 70s monographs and things, but not much. That book, Missing Time, changed everything. That people who had had these experiences, and for many of them, it wasn't goodness and light. Once again, times have changed. The FRE, the inheritors, so to say, of the Edgar Cayce Foundation, have been doing phenomenal work of correlating many, many accounts from around the world. They have an extraordinary research team. And one of the things that I've learned from them is that now, more or less informal stat, 2/3 of the accounts that they're getting are positive. I would say in the early 80s, later 80s, 90s, that was not the case. And I think there's a good reason for that. In part, is that nobody or nothing prepared any of us for this. And if you had a bedroom visitation and abduction, chances are it left you somewhat traumatized. You were not familiar with the literature. Nothing in your Judeo-Christian background had prepared it for you. You didn't study it in school. If anything, it was a subject that was relegated to fantasy. So if you knew it was happening, as Bud pointed out a number of times over the years, and you had the courage to go forward with it and then were attacked, it was like a rape victim being raped again for reporting the rape. And that's not a stretch of the imagination. That's a fair analysis, I think. Dave has said to me, I've even heard him say at the end of talks that he did years ago, somebody proved me wrong. I don't like the results of the data that I'm getting. Prove me wrong. And one can then theorize that, number one, as we talked about earlier on, we're dealing with a myriad of other intelligences. Some of them beatific, caring, knowledgeable, wanting us to join the Federation or whatever it's being called by any individual at any time, wanting us to evolve at least to the point that we are out of our Neanderthal stage of clubbing each other to death over where the line is drawn in the dirt. And I say this seriously. I would use the word mankind, but it's not the right word. Man. No woman came up with this concept of let's just spend as much money as we can and as much time finding out ways to make the people on the other side of the line more isolated, more the other, more the enemy, more the threat, and find more expensive and more horrific and more effective ways to kill them, and then protect our secrets because they're stealing them so that they can do the same with us. This is effing madness. And it's where we still stand now more than ever. One can hope that starting with this new administration, perhaps some of this can be turned around or mollified, but who knows? Again, they, in their myriad of differences, may be as different as we are in our cultures, in our philosophies, in our outlooks, in our histories, and go from those who truly want to help us because they care about us, because we're somebody's graduate experiment gone horribly wrong, and they need to correct it to get a good grade, or that they have an important relationship with this wonderful little speck of blue-green dust that we are destroying. The Blue Oyster Cult, my favorite heavy metal band, had a song years ago called I Am the One You Warned Me Of. Really nice heavy metal song. We are the infestation on the host organism. I think mystically minded people of extremist natures and faith want secret desires for conflagrations, for plagues, for epidemics, to wipe out part of the world so that the righteous can start again. And I think sometimes in a very scary way, when they get into positions of power, to betray some of my political thinking, that they edge it along. And it's one of the reasons I feel that God bless America for preserving the separation between church and state, that many people are trying to push it closer together and change that around. Again, I'm kind of going off on tangents here, but there may be other intelligences who do not wish us well, or who would like this real estate to be free of us and to begin to cure itself again. I can only say that Bud saw his job primarily as doing triage. People who were coming to him wanted some help, some reassurance, to meet with other people who had the same experiences. I was a regular part of support groups from the very first UFO abductee support group ever. And then there was a second one, and then one for women. And at a certain point, it just became too much. And Bud's health started to deteriorate as well. Thankfully, there are more and more responsible people out there, and you don't have to be a mental health professional to do it. There are certain serious protocols, respecting individuals, knowing how to control the room, being of goodwill, to allow an individual that is so inclined to do it. But Bud's understood, there was no question in his mind that people had positive experiences. That was great. And a note to close on here, and I'll start it by saying, I remember years ago being at a conference, Graham, they blend together, they just, after 100 of them, it's like, where was I? What state was it in? Standing in a lobby after somebody had given a talk, and you're chatting with people and listening to two people very close by who obviously had abduction experiences or felt they did, and getting this wonderful moment of conversation that I will never forget. And I remember feeling, I can't laugh now because this person's talking to me about something completely other, but that says it. The one person said to the other, so are you kind of like a Hopkins abductee or a Mac type abductee? Just code for welcome the Space Brothers, or John was cut from different cloth than Bud. Bud was the ultimate Western model, pragmatist, absolutely happy atheist, secularist, lover of humanity, rationalist. John was from a very progressive, very well-to-do, intellectual New York City family. He went to the best schools. He knew movers and shakers growing up. He had every credential imaginable. And I think probably in the 60s, from our conversations, like a number of us who did come of age in the later 60s, he gave up on the Western model to a degree of a way to affect positive change for humanity and started to look east more. We all recognize that thread in popular music coming out of the 60s and, self-help literature and all. And once he met Bud and started to take the subject seriously, number one, he had no doubt that these things were going on in the real 3D world, and that many of them were very traumatic to people. And once he started his group in Boston, like Bud would have people who would come into our group who loved their other intelligence experiences and had personal relationships with the beings and were growing from it spiritually. That was great. But the group that Bud was running overwhelmingly was not there for that. They were welcome to stay, but in many cases, seeked out John in Boston, the same way that people in Boston came down and stayed with friends in New York and attended our groups, because John, although he was an incredibly compassionate soul, and I will say this because most people who know who John Mack was or think they do, don't know this about him. I had a very real awareness of him some years before we became friends, and he started to, he and Bud became friends, in that doing crisis intervention work in New York City, I'd work a 7-hour shift once a week, and once a month I'd work an overnight shift. And there are times on a crisis intervention hotline, even in the middle of New York City, where nothing's going on. And we had a small library, not surprisingly, mostly psychology and crisis-related books. And there was a marvelous book there on the dynamics and observations about adolescent and teenage suicide that I learned a lot from. And it was written by one Dr. John Mack of Harvard. Many people don't know that about him. But John made it very clear at the outset that his interest in the subject was primarily how such experiences can be drawn from and used to help us all live more positive lives, take this phenomenon more seriously, bring us together in ways that normally we wouldn't think of. And that's what the rest of his life in great part was dedicated to. John and Bud absolutely adored each other and were the best of friends and had differences of opinion on the subject. In fact, you can seek this out. Of all of the dialogues, and it's a good note to close this part of our podcast on, of all of the dialogues I have ever heard on the phenomena we're talking about, contact and abduction, the most intelligent, the most thoughtful, the most riveting, breathtakingly smart, insightful dialogue I have ever heard was an evening with Dr. John Mack and Bud Hopkins that took place in Boston at the historic Faneuil Hall. I'm sure it's out there. With a few Google hits, you can probably find it. I remember at one point, there was a CD set available, but it's probably out there somewhere. And John Mack's organization, after he was tragically killed by a drunken driver in England in 2004, went from its original name and mandate to becoming the John Mack Foundation. And for interested parties, along with free, that's another great resource that you can consult, again, more for the positive side of the research going on around these fascinating subjects.
Yeah. I'll jump in real quick and just say that I know we often talk about when we're in roles like this, there is a certain amount of education or re-education with all of these conversations. And I will point out, I'm glad we just discussed John Mack and Bud's work, because when I was just starting to be interested in regression, that was one thing that fell short on me. I knew that it was a tool in ufology, but I didn't necessarily realize that there were these different styles of regression therapy, that were spearheaded by the greats like Mac and Bud. And so people can really go back and research that more and get more answers on that. It is fascinating to see how they compare and how they're different. So
you bring up a very important point to close on, because I've heard people wholesale dismiss hypnotic regression as a tool that's too flawed, or that they rely on it to a greater degree than maybe they should. What everything comes down to in regression therapy or hypnotic regression sessions, the validity, the importance, the value has to do with the practitioner, their training, their ethics, and their intention, and nothing else. Anybody can be certified to do it. Bud did something unlike anybody else I know in the field. He studied very carefully under a pioneering psychologist named Aphrodite Clamar, who, as I recall, the dedication in his first book is to, or she receives a very important mention. And he worked under her guidance. And she basically allegorically at his shoulder for 7 years. You know, he didn't just take a course and get out there. John, of course, was a clinical psychiatrist. He is co-founder of the psychiatric wing of Cambridge Hospital outside of Boston. But you don't have to have those kind of credentials. You need to be somebody who puts the individual first, who, if you lead them, leads them away, so that the person under will lead you back. No, my shirt wasn't blue, it was white, that kind of thing. We could go on, of course, but I'd like to close on a note that's sort of, well, breaking some new news. This is something that I've been quietly contemplating and actually working away at for more than a year now from my original invitation, and wanting to take time to grow into, because when I start, it will be a big change for me in the role that I'll be playing in this work and the professional tools that I'll be using. Starting on Monday, December 28th, 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, I will be joining you, Grant, on KGRA for a regular 2-hour live radio broadcast once a week. And it will be a somewhat different approach to broadcasting than many of my colleagues. Ultimately, there will be a sister platform, a digital TV platform with a lot of complementary material and other material that is not strictly on subject. The name of the show will be Meanwhile, Here on Earth. So mark your calendars for the first episode of Meanwhile, Here on Earth with yours truly. Monday nights, 6 to 8 Eastern Standard Time, KGRA. Go to KGRADB for digital broadcasting, kgradb.com, a few minutes before 6 Eastern Standard Time on Monday the 28th, and see what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm excited. I know this has been in the works for you for many months now. So yay, we love it when you spill beans with us, Peter. Congratulations. This is going to be so fun.
Obviously, my biggest challenge will be to come out of my shell and open up and find things to talk about.
Beautiful.
Oh, I don't think you'll have problems there, Peter.
Let me also end with a cliffhanger here. I always like to drop breadcrumbs and make people wonder, why doesn't he just say it? You and I, Peter, and you can just give me a yes or no and people will be left hanging. You and I had a meeting in 2013 at a cottage in Pennsylvania. There was a number of people there, and one of the people there is a guy that's sort of become famous since you and I had this meeting. And he wasn't anonymous at the time. He's known as Tyler D. He was written about in Diane Pasulka's book as this top NASA guy.
That's right.
You were in a meeting with me, so just yes or no, and we'll leave people hanging. Did you have a chance to talk to this guy when you were at the cabin?
No, and there was a reason for. I was intrigued, of course. I knew who he was. You may remember that we all got out there on a Friday. And of course, it was a marvelous cottage filled with incredible stuff in a beautiful location. You know, it was going to be the ultimate kind of guy UFO retreat. I made breakfast for everybody on Saturday morning. I love to cook.
Yeah, you're a chef, like Nicole.
No, she's a professional. I'm
it was good. It was
very happy amateur.
Incredible, yeah.
But something started to happen with me, and I realized, I am getting an attack of kidney stones, and I had to leave. I went to the city. I had to stay overnight, went upstate, be treated for it. I've been getting them on and off since I was 22, often with years in between. I've only had one attack since then, but that's what happened. I left. Wow. And I wasn't able to. For a number of, I wish it didn't happen for starters, of course, but I would have loved to. I would have loved to have that talk with him, Graham.
Beautiful. Thanks for that. Nicole, you can end it now.
I was just wondering if Chase had anything that he wanted to close with, and then we can wrap it up.
No, not at all. I think I got my core questions out. Sorry for not being very articulate on the first one there.
No, that was it. No, I saw myself right there. You're trying to form the words for a challenging question, and you want
and then part of this that's one of the hardest parts with this whole thing. Every time I have a conversation with Grant or yourself or anybody else that has any experience in this field, it's so difficult sometimes to articulate some of these things, and sometimes the words don't even fit with some of the experiences. So I really appreciate your time. Really glad to have been here. Thanks for having me, and yeah, thanks Nicole, thanks Grant, thanks Peter.
Thanks, Chase.
Most welcome, and thank you guys. Nicole and Grant, you let me know when we've got some options to pick up where we left off, and we will do some justice to music, the music business, music and paranormal, music and UFOs.
Beautiful.
Right. I think we'll keep this rolling. We might have to do a panel discussion with, painting artists. We might have to roll it into music and bring on some musician experiencers. But Peter, I'd love you to be a part of the panels too, if you have questions that you want to ask different artists. So I'll send you those dates and those links as well. And it's going to be fun to do this over the holiday season. I think it's going to take us a while, so we're in it for the long haul with this one. But Grant, thank you for being here today. Chase, thank you for being here. And of course, Peter, thank you. We could go another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but now's the time. Yep. Till next time, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.